Bienvenidos a Pasos de Éxito con Ana Cristina Martínez. Toda la información que necesitas para ingresar a las mejores universidades de Estados Unidos, siendo mexicano o de alguna otra nacionalidad. Bienvenidos.
Muy buenos días a todos nuestros queridos radioescuchas. Ustedes están sintonizando EXITO-MAYO-15-2021. 107.3. Mi nombre es Ana Cristina Martínez y esto es Pasos de Éxito. Es un programa donde participamos con la idea de promover la educación y escuchar historias de otras personas que por medio de la educación han salido adelante y están brillando en nuestra comunidad y en nuestro país, también a nivel estatal, por supuesto. Y este es el caso de la invitada del día de hoy. Esta mañana vamos a tener a Macarena Hernández. Ella es una mujer que nació en La Joya y después de ahí, cuando sabe que quiere estudiar, sabe que quiere salir adelante, sabe que ya no quiere ser una trabajadora migrante, entonces comienza su sueño de irse a estudiar a la universidad y fue aceptada en la Universidad de Baylor en Waco, Texas, y después hizo su maestría en la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Cuando ella se gradúa de la universidad y de la maestría, ella ya tenía una especialidad en lo que es la parte periodística y lo que le llaman professional writing. ¿Sí? Entonces, ella fue creando un portafolio de mucho trabajo y con mucha información sobre hispanos. Y su primer trabajo lo tuvo en San Antonio Express en el 2003, pero después va a ser un internado, le llaman internship, una forma de internado en el New York Times. Y allá ella se especializa como buena reportera en todas las áreas que tienen que ver con los inmigrantes, con los mexicanos, con los hispanos. Y bueno, pues de ahí ella es contratada para regresar y pues crear una edición especial para el San Antonio Express News. Y más adelante trabajó también para The Dallas Morning News y bueno, fue muy famosa, se hizo muy famosa a nivel nacional por haber escrito artículos sobre los hispanos, sobre la frontera, sobre muertes de inmigrantes, y de alguna forma pues otras personas lo vieron, lo copiaron, y así es como hoy en día se conoce ese gran escándalo del New York Times con el reportero Jason Blair. Y su caso fue tan famoso que hoy en día se conoce y lo utilizan en las clases de periodismo para que no se haga el mismo error nuevamente. Y bueno, pues su gran participación en el mundo académico, porque sigue siendo profesora de universidad y ahora es una de las profesoras que lleva el Fred Hartman Distinguished Professor of Journalism en su alma mater, Baylor University. Pues esta mañana vamos a tener entre nuestro programa y nuestros espacios a una gran mujer, una gran hispana, una gran colaboradora del mundo académico y aparte del periodismo, a nuestra querida amiga Macarena Hernández. Así que no se vayan, queridos radioescuchas, regresen para escuchar nuestra entrevista con Macarena, que está muy, muy interesante. No se vayan, ustedes están sintonizando XHGTS 107.3. Mi nombre es Ana Cristina Martínez y esto es Pasos de Éxito. Muy buenos días a todos nuestros queridos radioescuchas. Ustedes están sintonizando XHGTS 107.3. Mi nombre es Ana Cristina Martínez y esto es Pasos de Éxito. Pues como vieron el primer segmento donde les hablo de una forma con mucho entusiasmo y muy emocionada de tener esta mañana con nosotros a una de las mujeres más valientes, más valiosas que tenemos en nuestra comunidad hispana. Y les doy las gracias a Macarena por aceptar esta invitación a nuestro programa. Bienvenida, Macarena Hernández. Y ya sabes que siempre es un gusto saludarte y mandarte abrazos así como al aire, que le llaman air hugs.
Ana Cristina, el placer es todo mío. Tú, como decía mi profesor en la universidad, estás haciendo God's work, el trabajo de Dios. eres una mujer muy valiente, so me echas flores de yo ser valiente, y digo, ay, pero tú también, la Ana Cristina, doing God's work, educando a nuestras generaciones futuras.
It's a lot of work, and you know it is, but there's always a purpose, and there's always an inspiration like you, and you presented your life to us, and you are an example of greatness. You are an example of someone that left your little town of La Joya, and everybody knows you in the journalism world, and they know what Macarena Hernandez have done. But what do you think, Macarena, about the educating Hispanics right now at this time in our history?
I think it's so crucial, especially as we become in numbers, as we keep growing in this country. It's so crucial that education become part of our foundation, especially in communities like in La Frontera, where Laredo, El Valle, we're experiencing the highest levels of college-educated Latinos in the history of these regions, and universities are becoming homes for Latinos, and they were, as you know, we weren't always part of the educational system, so we have to play a lot of catch up. We've come a long way from the days when people didn't want to teach their kids Spanish because their mouths had been washed with soap in public schools in Texas for speaking the language. And now we're entering a new realm where the majority of children in the state of Texas are Latinos, and they're the future workforce of the state. And for Texas to continue to be healthy, we have to provide educational resources for these younger children. In places like the Valley, we didn't have the infrastructure, the educational infrastructure that we have now, right? And even then, we don't have a law school. If you want to go be a lawyer, you're going to have to leave. I would hope that we get to a point where if someone from Laredo or someone from McAllen wants to be a lawyer, they don't have to go very far from home to reach those goals. But that also shows you that, there's a big myth that Latino parents, that Latinos, and I heard it a lot when I was writing education columns for the Dallas Morning News, that those people don't value education. It's like a lot of us grew up in areas that were educational deserts, where the system had not invested in us because they didn't think we were worthy of investment. And I would say that that's still true in the educational system across the board, and that's why it's so imperative that we become our best advocates, because oftentimes there's very few outsiders advocating for people like us, educationally wise. And if Texas wants to have the healthy economy it continues to enjoy, we have to make sure that we're investing in communities that are homes to young Latinos like La Frontera, because they are the future workforce of Texas. Son los future doctors, the future lawyers. I can only imagine what this state is going to look like in 40 years. I'm sure they're going to look back and say, remember when very few of us went to college, or when universities were not set up to really deal or welcome people like us, And so that's why it's so imperative that predominantly Latino communities have access to quality higher ed and quality public schools.
And that has been a tremendous input from all the districts in Texas. They're pushing for the students to have a college degree, and it could be a technical career, or it could be a 4-year degree. But we are in compliance, and I think, 40 years from now, we're going to look back and we're going to say, wow, this has been a tremendous growth of our community, and we've improved the lives of so many people. And, by the year, the state of Texas is pushing that by the year 2030, 60% of the population has a college degree or a 4-year degree. So that's what they're pushing right now, and we can see it. We can see it inside every classroom, and I'm sure you can see it also in your classrooms.
Yes, and it is one of those things that it's gotten better every generation. When we think about why are you and I standing here, it's because, I think about my mother because she went up to 5th grade. She grew up in a rancho in Nuevo León. And it isn't that my mother was less capable than me, it's that she had less opportunities. So a lot of us owe our success that incrementally gets better with every generation, right? We owe it to people that oftentimes didn't have the same opportunities. And I tell my students, especially when I talk to young kids on the border, I tell them that we have an incredible opportunity that a lot of people don't get. As a child crossing that border back and forth to el municipio de Dr. Cos, Nuevo León, back to La Joya, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, I got to see the ways in which I was so blessed and so privileged. Because just by the fact that I had been born half a block from the Rio Grande and didn't have to worry about my papeles, didn't have to worry about whether I could go to college because I had been born in this country, it made all the difference. And I tell my students, it's not that we're better than the kids across the border. It's that we've been giving more opportunities. And when you're given more opportunities to those who much is given, much is expected, that is a reason that we should strive to even do more, because there are so many people, because of where they are born, because of their situation, and we see that on the border, their life is going to look totally different based on a birth certificate.
Oh, yes. And also based on a few feet from El Rio Bravo, El Rio Grande, it makes all the difference. Also, the opportunity that it's given in the United States for free education, free books, free the freedom
lunch
to have access to technology, it makes all the difference.
It makes all the difference, and we are so incredibly blessed. And I always tell students, if you don't use that opportunity, you're wasting it. I'm throwing it in the trash can, because there are so many kids across the Rio Grande, across the Rio Bravo, that are just as smart or even smarter, and the only difference is they have to work to eat, and they can't go to school, or they can't afford the uniforms or the books. And in the United States, te la ponen muy fácil. You know, if you're a good student, you might even get scholarships and get your whole education paid. If your parents don't make enough money, you get financial aid. And some of us get student loans, right, to make it through. But at least you can even apply for those, you know. And in other parts of the world, an education is a luxury. In the United States, an education is a human right. It's something que le toca a todos. And so I always remind them, hay que tomar full advantage of these opportunities, because it's not that we deserve them more than anyone else. It's not that we're better than anyone else. Just that we were lucky by virtue of what place we call home and what community we live in.
Tell us about your childhood. Tell us about your childhood growing up, una niña de descendencia mexicana, in the school in the United States. How was it for you? And where was that dream born that you wanted to leave La Jolla and go and study journalism and do, write? ¿Cuándo nació esa idea?
You know what? I think it's because one is that I was a migrant worker till I was like 14. And early on I decided and realized that I was a very bad migrant worker. Me iba a morir de hambre. Tenía que encontrar otra cosa que hacer porque I wasn't even good at that. And it's such hard work. And growing up in a crowded house, I'm one of 8 kids. I always had this kind of dream of having a space that was for me without having to wait for the bathroom, without having to sleep in a bed with 2 sisters. And I knew that the only way to do that was college. Even though most of the girls I was growing up with, everyone was getting married right after high school or even while they were in high school. I shouldn't say everyone, but a big number of them. That when I told my mom and my dad that I wanted to go to school 8 hours away from La Jolla in Waco, Texas, they're really horrified. And I can honestly tell you, my parents would have been happier had I gotten married at 18, 19 than me leaving home into a world that was so foreign to them. And it was really, really tough. My dad didn't want me to go away, and it fractured our relationship for a long time because me leaving to him felt defiant. And at the time, I was so young that I thought, oh, my dad is standing in the way of my dreams. And, oh, he doesn't want me to do this or that. And now I realize that my father, with a second grade education, the world that I was walking into was so foreign to him. And I wish that I had, because now thinking back, now seeing how the educational system works, now having been a college professor and seeing the leap some of us take just to get there, I realized that oftentimes we don't bring our parents along. I couldn't bring my parents along, like, esto es lo que voy a hacer, esto es lo que va a pasar, because I also didn't know. But I wish that schools would invest in, like, also educating the parents, because for so many of us, the route to college is very, very lonely. I was the first person in my entire family, generations and generations and generations of women who went to college. Thank God I wasn't the last. And but it can be very daunting. So if there's anyone listening to us right now that is in a similar position or maybe feeling overwhelmed by it, I just want them to know that sometimes you got to really listen to your intuition, because even though your parents know a lot, sometimes you're exposed to a part of the world or a part of the conversation about education that they have been excluded from. Also, if you know you want to go to college but you don't know what you want to study, it's okay, because that's what college is for, to figure it out. People feel like, if I don't know right away, what's the point of going? Well, you can go and take all those basics that they make you take. Anyways, you're going to be stuck taking basics for at least a year. And, college is not the answer for everyone. There are technical jobs. There are people who like to work with their hands. I think that's the most important thing, is like, what do you like to do? Do you want to be outdoors for the rest of your life and see the birds? Well, let's try and find a job that allows you to do that. Maybe you're a great mechanic, Well, think about yourself also as a business person, not just as a worker for someone else, and go and learn mechanics and maybe one day own your own shop. Because I think we also think about education as a 4-year institution being the only answer, and a 4-year institution is not for everyone. So I liked what you said earlier in the conversation, technical degrees. I have a brother who, works in construction, and he's done so well for himself. And he started off as a carpenter and became a master carpenter. So there's so many ways to make a living, and I think the most important thing is to find out what it is that you like so that you find a job that complements the stuff that already makes you happy or makes you feel full of purpose.
And you just mentioned something that there's a lot of kids that do not follow their passion. They follow, what the parents tells them, or, something that they saw, and they're now interested in that path instead of following their passion. You cannot go wrong when you follow your passion, and that's what you did. You found, in writing, you found your passion, and you pursue that passion, and you became one of the most influential writers, Hispanic writers from our time. And what happened when you were working in for the Dallas morning, it was the Dallas Morning News. What happened?
The San Antonio Express News, was it when Bill O'Reilly came after me or when I was plagiarized by the New York Times?
Oh, well, the thing is that many people do not realize that being so valuable, like you, and the information that you share, and there's always someone, because you did an internship with the New York Times, and there's always someone that look at the work you do and they wish they could do it, and that's when this happened. Can you explain to us?
Well, I did an internship with the New York Times right after graduate school, and I really liked working there. I ended up coming back to the Valley because my father died unexpectedly in a car accident. And 5 years after his death, I was working for the San Antonio Express News, and I read a story in the New York Times that sounds a lot like my story. And I kept reading it, and I realized that most of that story, which had been written by an intern, that someone that I had interned with at the New York Times 5 years before, Jason Blair, most of his story had been ripped off from my story in the San Antonio Express News that had run 8 days earlier. And that set up a whole chain of events. It became one of the, that's one of those case studies on plagiarism that's taught in journalism schools. I get emails from students from all over the country, from the Philippines, from, Venezuela, who are like, oh, I read about you in my textbook, because it became a case study on just how the ethics of being a journalist, the honor of being a journalist is really abiding by a really high ethical code of conduct. And the publisher of the New York Times, it became a huge, huge scandal. This was back in 2003. The publisher of the New York Times said that it was a black eye in the history of the New York Times, the 150-something years that the New York Times had been around. But what I learned about that is that even well-meaning reporters sometimes get facts wrong, It allowed me to see my profession as an outsider, because then I became a part of the story. I love writing about people. I don't like writing about myself. But in this case, I became a part of the story, and I got to see and feel what it's like for people to deal with the media, and why it can be intimidating, and why people sometimes are distrustful. I will say that the majority of journalists I know and the majority of journalists I enjoy reading, they're very hardworking people that really feel a moral, social obligation to making this world better. And people like Jason are in the minority, especially now with all the anti-media hate. It's important that we remind people that these journalistic institutions are the most diligent about getting the story right, than if you're reading something on Facebook, right, that your tia shared because they screenshotted it from something else. And so there's a very important place for journalists. We need more Latino journalists. There's no doubt about that. Because as long as we don't have more Latino journalists writing the stories about Latinos, we're going to have outsiders that parachute in to our communities, and the only story they want to tell is either cartels or immigrants.
Exactly.
And we know that the border is a more complicated and nuanced place.
Oh, yes, but they don't know. Like people outside of La Frontera, they have no idea, no clue the way we live here and we communicate, we commute. We have a very close relationship with Mexico. And in the year 2005, after all this incident, you went and worked for the Dallas Morning News. And that's there was another situation because of a column that you wrote on illegal immigrants, right?
Yes. So after the Express News, I went and became the first Latina columnist, editorial columnist at the Dallas Morning News, a newspaper that's been one of the oldest newspapers in the country. So when you think about that those voices, our voices, Latino voices, Black voices, have not always been at the table, And now I'm so thrilled because I meet so many young Latinos that are going into journalism because we understand our communities better than anyone that just parachutes in, spends 4 days, and then is telling the world what the story is. And that's what's been happening for decades and decades. At the Dallas Morning News, I wrote a column like 3 months into my time there about these 7 undocumented immigrants that had been beaten to death with bats in a string of robberies outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And I was so struck that when I was reading the story, I read it in the newspaper, and it was a tiny little brief, tiny little story, and no one was writing about it. And I wrote a column about how we have dehumanized immigrants so much, especially immigrants from certain countries. Immigrants from Mexico, but right now with Central America, that it's not even a big story. And I always say, if these people had been white, this would have been a national tragedy. These people were Mexican and undocumented, and it was a tiny brief. And I wrote a column about that, and this was back in, I think like 2005, 2006, the conversation about immigrants is so toxic that when we have these conversations and we dehumanize immigrants, like they're not even real people, it allows us to turn away and not have to look at the tragedy and not have to write about it. And the fact that this was such a short it was a little summary, it wasn't even a story, tells us that we're not even worth the ink of the newspaper. And in there I mentioned that Bill O'Reilly and other people didn't help the situation because they referred to immigrants as weapons of biological mass destruction, meaning they bring disease across the border. Ooh, these people are disgusting. These people aren't civilized. And como dicen los dominicanos, ¿pa qué fue eso? Because then Bill O'Reilly came after me. I was the lead of his TV show for 5 or 6 straight days, and he would put my picture up there and call me some crazy Latina that went to Berkeley, which is so funny because I spent 2 years getting a master's at Berkeley, but I spent 4 years at the largest Baptist university in the planet, Baylor. And so he was encouraging his followers to what nowadays they would call dox. Back then we didn't even have a word for it, doxing. And he wanted to get me fired, and so the publisher got over 3,000 emails most of them asking for me to be fired. a few of them saying, wow, I'm so glad I heard about this scandal because I know that you exist and that you're writing about this stuff. And there was very few voices back then. This is before social media exploded. And it was traumatizing to have death threats, rape threats. And all I was writing and advocating for in my column was human decency. But we throw that out the table. Just a few years ago, Bill O'Reilly was in the headlines, and this time was because he was being accused by women of inappropriate behavior, and he, left his job at Fox News. And when I read that story, I thought, oh my God, here I was all scared of this guy who obviously is not a very good person, and he lost his job. But there's a lot of damage done to our communities when the loudest voices are people advocating violence. I mean, I had to be escorted out of my building by security guards for at least a month, And then I would go home and I would think, wow, do people know where I live? Is someone going to come? And I only thought that because people were emailing me, telling me that they were going to come shoot me in my house. And I think that that conversation around people disagreeing has even gotten worse now with social media.
That's exactly what I was that's the path I wanted to go. Now that Hispanics are educating themselves, we know more about the law, about the educational system, the way things are done in the government. Now we know and we are aware. So because of this, Hispanics, now we have a different perspective, a different view, and they understand how things, are not going our way because we have more, more O'Reillys or whatever you want to call them, going after the idea of having more Hispanics well educated, and also, they want to demeanor the idea of no, pues tú eres hispano, no sabes lo que dices, o hablas sin saber. Those are things that are going to change and are changing. And now that you mentioned social media, it's very important that we understand the power of social media and the power of Hispanics in our state and the country.
I remember that in the 90s, people would say, oh, and maybe I said it too, I'm writing for the people who don't have a voice. And now I would edit myself and say, it wasn't that people like me didn't have a voice. They didn't have a platform. They had a voice. They didn't have a platform. And social media gave everyone a platform. And we're still in the early stages of social media where we're finding out the amount of misinformation, disinformation that gets circulated and how it can affect people. Whether you're talking about vaccines or immigration, whether you're talking about political candidates. And it is so important that if you're an active social media user, this is what I tell my students all the time, do your research before you repost or retweet. Because you may be retweeting misinformation. And sometimes it's someone who just didn't fact check because they're not trained journalists, so no se les ocurre. And sometimes it's actually people trying to actively misinform you to create chaos. I mean, this is not a sci-fi movie. It's reality. There are groups out there that are trying to sow dissent, that are trying to confuse people, and that are circulating disinformation, misinformation, purposefully.
So now you think it's harder to be a journalist? This is something that you share with your students at Baylor University. These are times when it's harder to put the truth on the table. Do you think it's harder right now?
I think it's harder because there's so many competing quote-unquote news outlets. So it's harder because there's just, can you imagine, in the history of this planet, this is the most information that a human being has ever been bombarded with. You open your computer and you're just bombarded with information. And it's really hard to know what's true and what isn't. And social media makes it so easy to just spread false stories. So in that sense, it's harder. Also, newspapers are still trying to figure out how much should a reporter interact with the public. And so you always hear about reporters getting in trouble with their news organizations because they tweet something that shows some bias. And, you know, as a journalist, your job is not to tell people how to feel unless you're writing columns. But if you're writing straight up news, your job is to just gather the facts. But then it's like, what are the facts? There's just non-journalists that are trying to push stories have gotten more sophisticated. And there's a lot of shameless lying. I think for me, but the great thing about the internet is that people fact check you, you know. So then it creates a whole other conversation. It used to be that you would write an article, you didn't know who wrote it, who read it. Now you write an article, there's going to be people either telling you they love you or that they hate you, and then there's going to be people fact checking you. And so you have to kind of have a thicker skin these days, you know, because of social media. And the truth is that it's human nature that we gravitate towards information that confirms how we already feel, you know, about said topic. And so you end up getting people who are just going to watch Fox News or they're just going to watch CNN because it just kind of reaffirms or affirms what you already believe. And so I think we need to be teaching media literacy classes at a much younger age to teach kids not all information is created equally and not all information is created to inform. And so in that sense, it's harder to disentangle the fact from the fiction, you know. We have to create just more well-rounded media consumers. Don't believe every TikTok you run across. Don't believe every Facebook post you read. Don't retweet everything unless you've checked it yourself, because you might be retweeting a conspiracy theory and not what the valuable information you think you may be retweeting. So I think more and more it's going to fall on individuals to be more active in how they participate on social media, because you could be sharing misinformation. And in some cases, it could be deadly, you know, like at the beginning of COVID when people were like, oh, it's a hoax, or oh, it's not that bad, oh, it's a flu. Well, you can't tell me that when we have like so many people dead, millions around the world. The numbers in the U.S. aren't even that reliable. You saw how the governor of New York was not releasing the numbers, you know, from nursing homes. And so even politicians manipulate the data because most of them just want to get reelected. So, you know, I tell my students, if it sounds like they're putting too much crema en los tacos, they probably are. Don't believe it. Keep doing research.
It's true. It's so true. So I'm glad that you are recommending that to the students, to be aware of the surroundings, to be aware of the information that is out there. But what else do you recommend our students that are, you know, tan chiquitos, they're in middle school, they're in high school, they still have their little eyes closed? What do you recommend?
I recommend to students to always, it's like one of my editors would say, if your mama tells you she loves you, triple check it. Meaning even the stuff that feels true to you, make sure you triple check it and find out what are reliable sources you can use, or else you become part of the problem. And think about, I am so glad that when I was 15, 13, there was no social media, or else I would have a transcript of my crazy emotions out in the world right now. And I didn't need to be sharing all those feelings with the world. It's okay to keep some things private. Or if you want to post, ask yourself, why am I posting this? Is this because I need someone to tell me I look pretty or handsome? Is this because I'm trying to, make someone jealous? And if your intentions with reposting something or posting something are not based on good feelings or if it's revenge or if it's because you're insecure, maybe you shouldn't post that. You have to really think before you post, and think about and a lot of I know people who have lost jobs because they were posting stuff on social media. I know people who have not gotten jobs because they went back and saw all these posts that they had written. One of the most recent cases is a young woman who was named Teen Vogue's editor-in-chief. It's a really big job. I'm sure it came with a big paycheck, but then a lot of the people on staff at Teen Vogue found all these tweets of her making fun of Asian people from when she was 17. And people really, there was outrage. She ended up resigning. I don't even know if she resigned willfully or maybe, a lot of the times when people said, oh, she resigned, it's probably because they told her she needed to. It's either you resign or you get fired. I don't know what the case was in her case. But the fact that something she did when she was 17 came back to haunt her and took away a dream job is a little life lesson for the rest of us about the fact that those posts live online forever, and that one day you may not feel the same way. And there's a lot of things that I felt so passionately about that I don't no longer see through the same eyes as I did when I was younger. And you are going to change your mind, and you are going to feel differently. And so just think about, is this something that a future employer would be okay with seeing before you post? Exactly. People using the N-word, people talking about other ethnic groups. I mean, that's never gonna. I hope no one. It's kind of heartbreaking if we're still there, considering that this younger generation has had more exposure. But I mean, that's why a lot of people have lost jobs, because of a lot of it is racist stuff that they were posting when they were much younger.
And it is a sad story, but it's a fact. That's something that the generation of our students, they need to understand. There are consequences. There are consequences.
There are consequences.
And there are
consequences.
It's a fact. And but one of the other things that I share with my student is you can never go wrong if you get educated. And the more educated, the more you are worth, not only as a Hispanic, but also as a person, as a professional. And that's something that we need to keep in mind for every student that we have in our classroom.
Yeah, and the more educated you become, the more you realize que no sabes nada. And it's a humility, right? It's a humility that I think we need to approach life with, because we don't understand everything. We are kind of waking up to the world every single day and understanding it differently. And I'm going to say, for me, myself, it took me years and years and years and years to understand myself, and why I reacted to certain situations in a certain way. So it takes years to understand yourself, and it takes even more to understand the world around you. And I always tell my students, listen with an open heart always, and you don't. And the most powerful thing for me is when I tell my students, I don't know. I just because I'm the professor doesn't mean I'm going to have all the answers. And it took me years, because I thought I knew everything when I was in high school. I thought I knew everything. And it took me years to realize that sometimes it's best to say, I don't know. And I think that is the smarter answer than trying to make something up.
True.
I don't know. I don't know.
I don't know. Can you please go and research and let me know and teach me, please? You know, we have to be humble also. And Macarena, we could be talking for hours and hours. Nos podemos quedar hablando aquí horas y horas y horas, pero yo te quiero agradecer que hayas estado esta mañana en Pasos de Éxito, que hayas compartido tu experiencia de vida con nosotros y hayas inspirado, porque sigues inspirando a muchos estudiantes que van a tus conferencias, que leen tus artículos, que eres una mujer que nunca se va a rendir ante cualquier situación adversa, sea la que sea, y ya lo platicamos en el programa. Vamos a encontrar situaciones muy difíciles, pero hay que saber cómo salir de ellas y salir de una forma más informada y más preparada y mucho mejor o mucho más fuerte, sí, mucho más fuerte. Esa es la palabra que estaba buscando.
Bueno, Ana Cristina, nada más quiero decirte que también a ti te admiro tanto, your love for teaching, because esas son las maestras que nos cambian la vida porque te contagian con querer aprender, con querer ser mejor. Y gracias por todo este trabajo que haces, tanto con este show, con las escuelas, con la comunidad de Laredo, que todos tenemos que hacer nuestro poquito granito de arena, ¿verdad? Y a veces pensamos que tenemos que ir a resolver los problemas mundiales y a lo mejor es nada más resolver el problema en tu casa. De lavar las vasijas para que no te grite tu mamá.
Es correcto. Macarena, muchísimas gracias y te agradezco muchísimo que hayas aceptado la invitación y te agradezco mucho que continúes hablando sobre nuestra comunidad de hispanos en los Estados Unidos y seas una representante muy digna de todas las personas que tienen una voz en los medios de comunicación. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Pues no, queridos radioescuchas, no se vayan, vamos a concluir nuestro programa y yo solamente quiero agradecerles a ustedes por sintonizar esta mañana XHGTS 107.3. Mi nombre es Ana Cristina Martínez y estos Pasos de Éxito. Buenos días a todos nuestros queridos radioescuchas. Ustedes están sintonizando XHGTS 107.3. Mi nombre es Ana Cristina Martínez y ustedes están escuchando Pasos de Éxito. Es un programa lleno de información que nos da y nos inspira a continuar educándonos, a continuar preparándonos, a ser los hispanos que en el futuro llevaremos las riendas de este estado y más adelante de la nación. Seremos una gran mayoría y una mayoría educada, una mayoría que dé la oportunidad de crear nuevas leyes, hacer más por nuestras comunidades, tener representación en todas las esferas del ambiente académico, el ambiente político, el ambiente laboral y el convertirse en profesionistas. Recuerden que es uno de los logros más importantes que hemos tenido. Nuestras familias, incluyendo la mía, inmigraron a los Estados Unidos y el sueño era recibir una educación, tener un trabajo, ganar dólares. Entonces, el sueño continúa y la educación continúa siendo un pilar muy importante de toda nuestra comunidad y de nuestro estado de Texas. Así que vamos a seguir luchando todos desde nuestra trinchera para poder ayudar y apoyar a otros hispanos que lo necesiten. Y recuerden que este programa es un programa que los invita a cada uno de ustedes a crear su mejor historia, a crear esa oportunidad para salir adelante por medio de la educación. Queridos radioescuchas, esto fue Pasos de Éxito. Ustedes escucharon esta mañana XHGTS 107.3 y mi nombre es Ana Cristina Martínez. Gracias por acompañarnos. Que tengan un buen fin de semana.
Esto fue Pasos de Éxito con Ana Cristina Martínez. No te lo pierdas. Todos los sábados encuentra todos los programas pasados en el canal de YouTube Pasos de Éxito y búscanos en Facebook. Dale like a la página Pasos de Éxito aquí en el 107.3 FM.